Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Discovery Debrief, your latest jaunt into discussing the latest trek into the final frontier, Star Trek Discovery. I'm co-host Chris Clow, and I'm joined by two other members of our regular panel of bold Trek franchise explorers, including Rachael Clow.
Oh, hello.
Hello. And Cicero Holmes.
Tarsus IV. Tarsus IV.
Remember the 4000.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Zachy isn't able to join us on this one only because he hasn't read the book that we're going to be talking about in this issue, but you'll, of course, be hearing from him again on our next episode, which should be exciting, I think. I've got an iron in the fire that I'm hoping is definitely going to pan out, particularly for people who are listening to this episode. So keep your eyes on the social media channels for the show. So we have talked for a while over the past couple of months about what we're going to be doing tonight for the subject of this episode. And now we're making good on that chatter by focusing in on Star Trek Discovery Drastic Measures, the second tie-in novel to the Discovery TV show by author Dayton Ward. And if you remember back in episode 9 of Discovery Debrief, Rachael and I went solo to discuss the first tie-in novel by David Mack, which was called Desperate Hours. This new book takes a pretty different approach to its material, though, so it should make for an interesting discussion. It plays with something totally different in the timeline of these characters and in a totally different spot, which made for a good reading experience, and hopefully it'll make for a good listening experience, too. First things first, though, as always, let's check in with what our panel's been up to. How are you guys doing? What's the time in Trek been like since we last recorded? Rachael, you have been rewatching Deep Space Nine, and now you're starting to get into some pretty exciting territory, right?
Yeah, I'm in the 6th season,
wow.
right?
Yeah,
it is great.
Yeah.
I haven't gotten here as much, so it's like familiar, yet I can't quite remember what happens.
That's good.
And it is fantastic, Chris. I forgot.
Really? See, this is the you sit there stone-faced, but inside you're apparently going, yeah! So what is it that gets to you so much about this season specifically?
Well, Gul Dukat has entered his final form as batshit crazy Gul Dukat.
Yeah.
Which is great. And I just, like, there's so many things. Like, there's an episode in, like, late 5th season where, like, Garrett kills some people. And I'm like, holy crap. Like, Garrett just killed some people. And I'm like, I bet they never even reference this again. But they do. Like, the next time, because when he kills the people, he holds Nog hostage. Mm-hmm. And so the next time he's alone with Nog is like, I'm not turning my back on you. I'm like, yeah, that's great. And just, I the whole interlude where the Dominion is occupying Deep Space Nine is great. And Kira sort of coming to terms with the fact that she's become a collaborator, and then
it's hard to watch, kind of.
But even the one-offs are good. Like, I watched one last night with Morn.
Who mourns for Morn?
Morn's death.
Yeah.
And it was just a really fun little episode.
Yeah, that's a good one. And
good Quark-isode.
Yeah. Always. I mean, it's if you can say anything about Quark, it's that he's entertaining. And that also has that point when they're defending the station from the Dominion, who are actually coming to occupy it. Because that's the season 5 finale, I believe.
Yeah.
Has my favorite Garrick tete-a-tete with Odo, where he basically says to him, well, Odo illustrates to him that you would shoot a man in the back. And Garrick says, well, it's the safest way, isn't it? And it's like, it's such a pure Garrick line. And he says, so you're sorry that you didn't shoot Dukat? And Garrick just like wistfully, but kind of mournfully says, by the time this is over, we're all going to be sad I didn't shoot Dukat. Wow. And, he was right in more ways than one. But yeah, the war, as much as I know some Star Trek fans of the time were against the war, it was such an engaging arc for that show. It really does elevate that show very, very highly, in my estimation. But
I was
Cicero.
just amazed at the fact that Rachel's inner voice is Lil Jon. Yeah.
Oh, I wasn't even thinking of that. Oh, well, hey, could be worse.
What?
Right? Okay. Very well said. Yes, absolutely. Well, Cicero, you're on your own jaunt through a less explored aspect of the Star Trek universe. You've got to be coming up near the end of your Voyager watch through. So how is that going? Where are you? And how are you enjoying
I am
it?
happy to say that I have returned to the Alpha Quadrant.
Oh,
Yes.
all right. You have seen
Yes,
Endgame.
I have seen Endgame. Actually, just this past week finished. 4 months in, I made it through all 7 seasons of Voyager. And what it made me want to do was restart Deep Space Nine because it had been so long since I'd watched that series. But I figured, you know what? Hold on, my brain needs a break from the Gene Roddenberry universe. And maybe I'll watch some other things. So I'm watching Jessica Jones season 2. But so I have finished Voyager. I have watched Captain Janeway and her crew make their way from the Alpha Quadrant to the Delta Quadrant and back again. And it was a fun time. Definitely a better show than people give it credit for.
Okay, yeah. See, that's what I was going to ask you next. Is how?
Yeah, it's not nearly as maligned as Enterprise was. I think people were getting, by the time Enterprise came, it was a bit of a departure, and I think people were having suffering from Star Trek fatigue when that hit. I think Voyager did a little to push that on. The absurdity of Voyager, like the season of Voyager or the series of Voyager started by them saying they've got limited resources, both energy resources and armament resources. And then I think there's a YouTube video of like every time the Voyager or Voyager shot off photon torpedoes. So they had an outrageously low complement of photon torpedoes, somewhere around like 40 when the show began. And then in the 7 years, they must have shot like 1,000 torpedoes. And it was, so that was really absurd. And I was listening to another show where they were talking about, what is that 2-parter where they run into the other Starfleet vessel in the Delta Quadrant? And
the Equinox.
The Equinox, right. So they board the Equinox, and the Equinox is all disheveled. They really don't have any their resources are really low. The ship itself is in ill repair. Everything is really kind of gone to the wayside on the Equinox. But then you go back to the Voyager, and the Voyager looks like they just had a cleaning crew come through. Like you can eat off of any deck in all of Voyager for the entirety of the show, and that just didn't seem realistic. But those are things to quibble about and things to be critical about. For a show that was very, very good. And, I will be part of the Neelix Defense Force because another portion of the show that was maligned was the portrayal of Neelix, or the Neelix character in general. Besides him being a interspecies pedophile, outside of his questionable romantic interest in the beginning of the series, he really did while he playing the foil to a lot of Tuvok's kind of shenanigans or what have you, he definitely had a role on that show that I think was underappreciated. So I really got a chance to like what he did. And I was kind of sad that the show was ending. But yeah, it was a good show. It was a good show.
Good
time.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it, and now that blind spot is totally cleared up. So as far as your Trek perceptions are concerned, so that's going to be great going forward, especially if and when Voyager becomes a topic of a full episode. Then you'll probably be our go-to Voyager expert, since you're the one who most freshly watched it.
Fresh in my mind.
Yeah.
Except absolutely. I can't remember the equinox.
Well, the only time that Voyager seemed disheveled was during the Year of Hell, but of course that doesn't count.
Right.
So yeah, you're right. The only thing that I took from that was that the equinox, that was sort of like a manifestation of them doing things the wrong way. And since Voyager did things the right way, their ship is in better shape. But is more like
right.
Still doesn't necessarily make sense considering the stress of the journey that they were on.
Wait a minute. There's one other major bone that I have to pick with this show. There was an episode late in season 6 or in early season 7 where they pick up these fugitives that were on this prison barge on their way to the death row on, for this planet or a species or what have you. And there was a prison ship that was about to explode, and the Voyager crew beamed everyone aboard. And there were, all of these hardened criminals and the cops, so whatever, the correctional officers, whatever, the prison guards. And the prison guards treated everyone like crap. And there was this one dude that was super homicidal. And it turns out that dude had something wrong with his brain that didn't allow him to feel empathy. And 7 of 9 used one of her nanoprobes, and it repaired part of his brain, and now he felt empathy. And it was all about the reprieve that he could get, and kind of the reversal of fortune for that particular character. The subplot, the B plot, was about Neelix talking to this other guy who was part of this marginalized race of people, where the guy basically said he happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and all of his people are incarcerated at rates that are far beyond their the rates of this other race, and not commensurate with their population size.
Right.
So, immediately as a person of color, made me think of the way that black people and marginalized people and people of color in this country are incarcerated at incredibly alarming rates. And have been, completely disenfranchised. And this guy was talking about how he's disenfranchised. And Neelix went to bat for this guy. There was a power outage on the ship, and there was a impromptu prison riot where these guys were trying to get away. And the dude tries to get away, and he now looks at one of his oppressors, and he was going to kill one of the oppressors. And one of the officers, and Neelix sees him, and he gets a disappointing face. And then they had this B story. As soon as that happened, they just stopped. They went and ignored completely the fact that this guy had been systemically, him and everyone that looked like him and everyone that was from his race had been systemically marginalized and disenfranchised by this other race of people. And that was the predicament that, that those circumstances of what caused his predicament. And they were just like, oh, well, you know what? You messed up. You should have, when the alarm went off or when the force field went off, you should have just not done anything. And then I would still like you, and maybe we would be having a trial to see if we could get you off as well. But you tried to get away, so now screw you, not black guy.
So kind of a half measure as far as illustrating a very real problem.
Right, exactly. And so I was very, very upset at the end of that episode because of the way they handled that. But yeah, again, bones to pick. Sorry, Chris, you were going to ask a question.
I was just going to ask you how Endgame matched up with the other finales that you'd seen.
So that, I mean, they're all special snowflakes. I think that Endgame worked really well for what it was definitely better. It sat with me better than Enterprise's ending.
Sure.
That whole holodeck thing. I mean, obviously you did get some historical context within that one and the formation of the Federation. But the fun thing about Endgame was that Voyager throughout the series played fast and loose with time travel. And the fact that the last episode was another time travel episode worked perfectly within the context of that show. It did make things a little super neat at the end.
Right.
Because, clearly they went in and, not spoilers for, non-spoilers for people who haven't seen Voyager all the way through. There were some crew members that had died, and Admiral Janeway decided to use time travel yet again to right those wrongs. And, so this is the spoiler part. She did right the wrongs. So, and
what a shock.
Right. And so those crew members were alive at the end of the episodes. But yeah, so I mean, outside of that, like, it would have been nice. It would have been very Deep Space Nine-y of them to kind of have some characters not make it. And you just have to sit and live with the fact that someone that you may have liked didn't make it to the end and didn't, kind of fulfill their dreams. But, outside of that, it was fine.
Sure. Yeah. Rachel, do you like Endgame just as a finale?
I barely remember it.
Well, I guess that says that. All right. Well, fair enough. Well, always good to catch up with what everybody has been doing in Star Trek. But now let's move on to the main event where we talk about the latest Star Trek Discovery tie-in novel, Drastic Measures. Now, a quick note before we begin. This is very much a cumulative episode of Discovery Debrief, so that means that we're going to talk freely about everything that transpired in the show's first season and how it relates or doesn't relate to this book. So spoilers will abound for the show if you haven't actually finished Discovery Season 1. Like our last book discussion, we're not going to go too deeply into the plot except for maybe at the very end, but we likely will be discussing some aspects of it that you can only glean by reading the book. So just fair warning, if this is a book that you plan on reading and you want to go in completely cold to the story, then you may want to save this episode for when you actually have finished it yourself. Otherwise, if you're going to stick with us, thanks for coming aboard. The Trek that we're going to be talking about, besides the novel, will consist of, like I said, Star Trek Discovery Season 1, The Conscience of the King, Season 1, Episode 12 of Star Trek The Original Series, basically provides the backbone for this entire story. So if you have not seen that episode and are planning to read this book, definitely watch it. Or I mean, if you've read the book already and you haven't seen the episode, then lucky for you, it makes for a great sequel.
Right.
and wraps everything up pretty well. So definitely watch that.
So Chris, so you're saying Season 1, Episode 12. Wikipedia says Season 1, Episode 13. Netflix has it as Season 1, Episode 14.
Okay, so what's probably happening is that The second one that you mentioned is Counting the Cage as episode 1.
Right.
Memory Alpha counts the cage as episode 0 and goes in broadcast order. So I think that accounts for the discrepancy. But as it's listed on Memory Alpha, it's episode 12. But on Netflix, yeah, it probably reads differently. But either way, definitely watch The Conscience of the King. However you've absorbed this book, whether you're planning to or whether you already have, watch that episode. It's very important. We are going to also do a loose mention of the Counterclock Incident, which is season 2, episode 6 of Star Trek, the animated series. And the reason for that will become clear. There's a couple of loose aspects of the continuity of Star Trek Enterprise that might come up, though not directly. It's just, I'd like to put that down as a baseline. And finally, Rachael is actually going to offer some comparisons later on to the way that the Tarsus IV massacre was depicted in another high-profile expanded universe work, the autobiography of James T. Kirk by author David A. Goodman. But the big one, unsurprisingly, is The Conscience of the King. That's definitely the one to have seen. So let's begin. So here's the description of Drastic Measures from the book jacket. It is 2246, 10 years prior to the battle at the Binary Stars, and an aggressive contagion is ravaging the food supplies of the remote Federation colony, Tarsus IV, and the 8,000 people who call it home. Distress signals have been sent, but any meaningful assistance is weeks away. Lieutenant Commander Gabriel Lorca and a small team assigned to a Starfleet monitoring outpost are caught up in the escalating crisis and bear witness as the colony's governor, Adrian Kodos, employs an unimaginable solution in order to prevent mass starvation. While awaiting transfer to her next assignment, Commander Philippa Georgiou is tasked with leading to Tarsus IV a small, hastily assembled group of first responders. It's hoped this advance party can help stabilize the situation until more aid arrives, but Georgiou and her team discover that they're too late. Governor Kodos has already implemented his heinous strategy for extending the colony's besieged food stores and safeguarding the community's long-term survival. In the midst of their rescue mission, Georgiou and Lorca must now hunt for the architect of this horrific tragedy and the man whom history will one day brand Kodos the Executioner. And I got to say, when I first read that description, I was immediately excited for this book. First of all, as a big TOS guy, Tarsus IV is something that looms over 23rd century Star Trek continuity because it shouldn't happen, right? I mean, the Federation is an advanced society. Something like that, a heinous act of brutal murder and martial law, should not happen in the mid-23rd century, but it gets passed. So right off the bat, this book differentiates itself by being different on a kind of fundamental level when compared with the first novel, because Desperate Hours was far more of a prequel with close proximity to the beginning of the show, taking place just 1 year before Discovery's pilot episode. Drastic Measures, on the other hand, takes a much further look back in the lives of the two major characters introduced to the canon by Discovery in the forms of Philippa Georgiou and Gabriel Lorca. So first things first, without specifics, give us your overall impressions of the book. Rachael, how does Drastic Measures compare to Desperate Hours for you, and what did you think of this story as it was told here?
I remember thinking while I was listening to it that they're more similar than I thought they were going to be.
Really?
Because they're both kind of the Philippa Georgiou coming to rescue a colony in distress. So, I mean, the people around her are different, but they kind of had some similar vibes due to that. But of course, this was a lot more harrowing in that there was a lot more scary stuff happening and, 4,000 people getting murdered and that. But, overall, this book was more action-packed, I thought.
Mm-hmm.
I think it had... I don't know, I wanted to say that it has more, callbacks to other, TOS stuff, but that might not be true, because there was callbacks to, Pike and
Spock.
The Cage. Yeah, so maybe
Spock
that's not
was
true.
A major character.
But, overall, I think I liked this one slightly better.
Okay. And you liked the last one reasonably well.
Yeah. It was good. Yeah.
All right. Very good. Cicero, you've hinted in the past that you've absorbed expanded universe stuff in other universes, particularly Star Wars. So before you tell us what you think of this book, give us a brief overview of your history with EU and tie that in with how Drastic Measures adds up in your estimation.
So Star Trek EU, this is the very first book that I've ever read.
Okay.
I think I want to say that there were a couple of books that I may have purchased or may have been given that I was going to read and didn't. But yeah, so this is the very first Star Trek EU book that I've ever read. I have, when the Star Wars EU began in earnest in the early 90s, mm-hmm. I really consumed that voraciously. And I think over the first 5 years, there may have been like maybe 3 or 4 of those books that I hadn't read.
Okay. Wow.
So yeah, I was super deep.
So you were into like the Yuuzhan Vong invasion and
big time,
cool.
Big time into Talon Karrde and Mara Jade and Grand Emperor Thrawn and yeah. So all of that stuff. This book, Drastic Measures, was fun. It was a fun book to listen to. The narration was really well done, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point during the course of this. But yeah, it was a really good book. Again, the funny thing is, so I watched Conscience of the King today. Mm-hmm. I feel like for the first time, I know I've seen it before.
Sure.
Because I've seen every episode of TOS, but it may have been, without an exaggeration, it may have been 30 years since I had seen that.
Oh, wow.
Seen that episode. So, the fact is that my memory of those things or of that episode was non-existent at this point. And especially compared to my memory of the events of Tarsus IV, as a result of reading Drastic Measures. Mm-hmm. As a fan of Star Trek, I always knew about Tarsus IV, and it was always something that, like, it was definitely something that was in my head. Tarsus IV is important, but I don't know if I ever really understood or remembered why. And so reading this book really helped, obviously fill out that world and color that world for me. And then going back, and I did this in reverse, and then going back and watching Conscience of the King, which works out perfectly because that again transpires 20 years after the events on Tarsus IV.
Yeah.
So it was perfect to have all of that kind of sit together, and really fill in all of those gaps. So it was a great book. It was a really, really great book. If you're listening to this now, if you're still listening to this now and haven't read the book, read the book. It's really good.
Yeah, I definitely tend to agree. I remember first becoming aware of Tarsus IV because obviously as a kid, growing up mostly in the 90s, I would voraciously watch a Star Trek rerun whenever it came on, but I was never able to actually watch the show from beginning to end in full succession until it was released on DVD. And right. That's when I actually fully absorbed the original series for the first time. I mean, I had seen several of the episodes multiple times. I remember when I was a kid going to Blockbuster and renting an episode at a time because they were all just on single VHS tapes. So some episodes I had seen a lot more than others. Like The Enemy Within, I basically have memorized because that was right. one of the ones that I had rented as a kid. But I remember the first time when watching the whole show that I watched The Conscience of the King, and it was kind of horrifying because, you have these people on the ship, a friend of Captain Kirk, systematically murdered. Riley, who I always liked, almost gets murdered.
Right.
And not in a clean sort of kid-friendly way either. I mean, it's 60s TV, so it's not going to be egregiously violent. But compared with other episodes of TOS, Conscience of the King is pretty dark. So the imagination then dictates the events on Tarsus IV have to be crazy dark and just unbelievably horrific. And this book kind of does fulfill that imagination I'd had about the events of Tarsus IV for a very long time. It gave it a more realistic bent, I guess, because you get a very boots on the ground perspective from the characters, which is great. I mean, how does a military officer, particularly in the case of Gabriel Lorca, respond to a crisis like this when backup is, for all he knows, 1,000 days away or longer?
Right.
So that stuff, the book was far more harrowing than I thought it would be. And it made it endlessly exciting to absorb. So I was very, very happy with it. I liked it as much as I liked Desperate Hours. I like Drastic Measures significantly more. Not just because it gives greater context to a big event in the 23rd century, but because, and we'll get into this later, but it also gives us a really in-depth look, first of all, at Georgiou, who initially wasn't really going to be included in this book. It was actually Dayton Ward who insisted that he tell a story with her because it was mostly supposed to be about Lorca, from what I understand. Huh. And as a duo, they worked really well in this book. Yes. So I was just over the moon about that. So yeah, I really liked it. But first things first, or I guess second things second, let's talk about the characters, particularly when it comes to the two leads. So first off, elephant in the room that we can't help but notice. When this book was first announced, it was announced in mid-October of 2017. The show had only been on the air for a couple of weeks. We had no idea that the Gabriel Lorca featured in this book is a guy that we would never actually meet on the show.
Right.
So automatically, the book takes on more value because, and I'll bring this up later too, but the book is written in conjunction, not directly, not hand in hand, but it features the involvement of some aspect of the real Discovery writer's room. Like they check on things when it comes to these Discovery tie-in novels to make sure that basically things are kosher with the show.
Right.
So the full knowledge of the writer's room affects what is put into these books to some degree. And so that puts an entirely other dimension to me on this book, because it's the characterization of Commander Lorca, Lieutenant Commander Lorca, of the Prime universe, since we only got to know his Mirror Universe counterpart. So what do you guys think of the characterization of Lieutenant Commander Lorca of the Prime Star Trek universe, particularly as it relates to the Mirror Universe counterpart that we got to know so well over the course of the show's first season? Rachel?
You want me to move closer?
Why don't you scoot the chair closer?
Oh, that wasn't good for the floor. Okay. What do I think of Lorca?
Are you not paying attention?
I am paying attention. I just don't.
Caffeine?
I don't remember what the question is. Okay, just what I think of.
What do you think of the characterization of Prime Lorca as it relates to the guy we met in the show?
Okay, I think that Prime Lorca is more moral and more controlled. Mm-hmm. Right. So he, has just lost the woman he's in love with. And I feel like Mirror Lorca would probably go medieval on everybody and just start killing people. But Prime Lorca really keeps it, he keeps it reined in for the entirety of the book. And he's feeling it, because of the narration.
Yeah.
He's feeling all of this rage and this anger, but he still he acts properly throughout the whole.
He acts like a Starfleet officer.
Yeah, he acts like a Starfleet officer.
Unlike the guy we met.
Yeah, yeah. So I think there's one passage in the book where he's thinking about punching a guy, and Mir Lorca would have punched the guy.
Oh, totally.
So
would have broken his nose probably.
Yeah, so that's the difference between them.
Yeah, I think that's well said. Cicero, how did this strike you? Because I'm not sure how aware you were necessarily of the fact that Prime Lorca was going to be featured, and coupling that with the fact that we never met him on the show. So did you find this like educational when it came to the Prime Gabriel Lorca, and how did you think the two men compared?
Well, I've definitely thought this was an education in a guy that we never got to meet, never had a chance to meet, nor will we ever meet, Chris.
We're hey, know where this is going at the end.
I do. But having said all of that, it was a great education in who Prime Lorca was, or is, and how much being a Starfleet officer meant to him. Because clearly he was in love, and was so in love that he had daydreamed about giving up his commission to live with this woman, and this woman is murdered by this man who, in just the coldest and most efficient of ways. She was murdered as if she was murdered by a Terran, along with 3,999 other humans and other species on Tarsus IV. And he was able to still continue to do his job despite himself, because being a Starfleet officer meant that much, and the tenets and the principles of Starfleet meant that much to him, and he believed in them, versus the Lorca that we know and loathe. That guy would have agreed with Kodos.
Probably.
He would have said, "Hey, look, that's an effective way to make sure that everybody else survives." And then if backed into a corner where he had to do a job, that no one would have been left alive. There were so many opportunities that the Lorca in this book had to end the lives of people, and he chose not to. That the Lorca that we got to see on Discovery would not have shown anywhere near the level of restraint that we saw in Drastic Measures by Lieutenant Commander Lorca. So Captain Lorca, his body count would have been at least a fourth of Kodos the Executioner.
Yeah, probably.
He would have been Lorca the Disintegrator. So
yeah, that's well said. I'm obviously I'm in agreement with you guys. I can understand now why this guy ultimately became a Starfleet captain, because obviously, having only met the Mirror Universe version of Lorca, it's hard to tell exactly why the Prime version had earned a commission for a Starship Command. And the ability for Prime Lorca to make a decision quickly while also adhering to not just his training in the most specific way possible, but he also does have a belief in the ideals that define the Federation. It's a darker flavor, sure. Like there are some noted similarities, I think, between the two Lorcas, but this guy is a good man. Like, I can say that with certainty. You cannot say that with certainty about Mirror Lorca. He's a driven guy. He's a bit obsessive and a little creepy, but I don't know if he's necessarily good. No. Gabriel Lorca
most certainly not good. So you can say that with
he was the opposite of good.
Say that with certainty that he
with absolute certainty,
not good.
Yes. Not a good guy. Not by any stretch of the imagination. So that's another reason why I hope Zachy reads this book at some point, because he it's something that he talked about throughout our entire discussion of the first season. He likes the good versions of these characters, and Lorca, he's similar enough to the Mirror Universe version of Lorca that I can see some crossover in some character traits. But this guy, he's very much like a Star Trek Batman in the sense that he's a good guy, but he comes with a harder edge to him. Yeah. And I like that. Unsurprisingly, I like that quite a bit. But let's move along to Commander Georgiou, because she was also the second major character of focus here. What did you guys think of this earlier look at her career and what her perspective provided to the story? Do you think you might know her a little bit better after reading this, or do you feel like you maybe didn't really get anything essentially insightful about her in this story? Rachel?
I mean, I think I feel like I know her a little better just from spending more time with her. I don't think there were any like crazy revelations about her or anything, but I definitely felt like she was the same character.
Yeah.
That from Desperate Hours and from when we saw her in Discovery.
Yeah. Do you find her as a relatable protagonist this time? Because we got such a look at her, the first time we meet her in the book, she's like kind of tired because she hasn't had enough sleep and she hasn't had enough coffee, but she still has to deal with these administrative tasks, which comes with the territory. And then she's thrown into this impossibly terrible situation, and her reaction and her mettle is tested.
I didn't have a ton of feelings about her characterization.
Okay.
It was just, that's Georgiou.
Yeah.
And she was being Georgiou.
Yeah.
And it was true to what I understand her character to be.
Very good. Cicero, how about you? What do you think?
Well, considering that I hadn't read Desperate Hours, it was cool to get to know a little bit more about this person that we didn't get a lot of time with within Discovery, the show. Mm-hmm. So that was really great. But I think Rachel is right. She's kind of laughing about it, but I think she is right. Like there were no revelations. There was nothing about the characterization of Philippa Georgiou in Drastic Measures that led me to believe that I'd gleaned some like terribly new insight about her, outside of the fact that she was ready to leave the Narbonne to go on to her next ship, to actually go on to a was she set to go on a Constitution class, or at least an Intrepid class starship?
I believe that it is a Constitution class that was named as the Defiant. As far as I know, there was only one Defiant in the 23rd century, and it was a Constitution class, and it's destined to end up in the Mirror Universe.
Right. So I mean, the fact is that she was kind of, I mean, she wasn't phoning it in, but she was definitely kind of done with this assignment. She was ready to move on to more interstellar stuff, and the fact is she was thrown into this like incredibly terrible, just major moment in the history of the Federation. And she performed admirably. She performed as she performed in a way that would lead me to believe that she is the same woman that we saw on Discovery. And even Emperor Georgiou, that she was just, a few degrees removed from Emperor Georgiou, even in so much that, like, I talked about Emperor Georgiou being matronly towards Burnham during the show. You can definitely see those aspects of Prime Georgiou and Commander Georgiou during Drastic Measures. That she definitely she can be hard when she needs to be. She was all but ready for command. And then when she needed to show a softer side, she can turn that on within a heartbeat and be as welcoming and as warm as you would need her to be in any given moment.
Yeah, and she had her faculties about her in all of these crazy situations. Like you said, I mean, she's not going to throw a scowl at a little child who has a stuffed Andorian under her arm,
right?
Just because she's going through something that's personally stressful. She knows how to react to a certain situation. Or later on, when she comes upon a very strong-willed teenage boy, she reacts with being impressed at his ingenuity in trying to solve a specific problem that she also has.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, this just makes me pine for her more in the show. Like, I hope that we actually do get at least one episode of the show in a future season that goes back to her in command of the Shenzhou with Michael as her executive officer. Just because she is, as far as I feel anyway, maybe you guys disagree, but as far as I feel, she is the only sort of classically molded Starfleet captain that we have gotten out of Discovery thus far. That, I mean, it's twofold. That makes Discovery infinitely more interesting because it is so atypical. But as a Star Trek fan, I also kind of miss that certainty that comes from such an effective commander. We don't know who the new captain of the Discovery itself is going to be. And obviously we're going to see Captain Pike, who is a decorated guy in and of himself. But over the show so far, where we stand right now, the prime example of a Starfleet captain is Philippa Georgiou. And I would love to see more stories that feature her brand of command and the lessons that she undoubtedly imparted on both Michael and Saru. So I loved pretty much every moment that she was in this book because she brought a level-headedness that Lorca certainly didn't have, but was also a very recognizable truthfulness to sort of the best of what Starfleet officers can be. Like, she had no greater destiny than to be a Starfleet captain. And this book just kind of pushes that forward even more in my mind. But let's go along to a couple of other characters, because we met quite a bit of new characters that are only appearing in this story. And I have a particular soft spot for Captain Corapati of the Narbonne. I thought he was a great character.
Right.
And of course, little Shannon Moulton, who would end up being kind of important at the end of the book, but she provided that look at the more tender side of Georgiou that I certainly wasn't expecting this situation to bring out of her. And I liked Lorca's security team as well that actually went after Kodos. So, Cicero, why don't you start us off? Did anyone else sort of stick out to you in reading the book?
I really liked all of Lorca's security team. I can't remember all of their names. But they seemed plucky. They really seemed like about their wits and were ready to. So they were a microcosm of their commanding officer, and that was not Captain Lorca, Lieutenant Commander Lorca. All of them thrust into this guerrilla warfare situation. All of them really worked well together, and I would love to see their kind of misadventures on the screen. Like, they just seem like the type of guys that it really made me think of, like, BSG or something else, where there are guerrilla commandos that are becoming insurgents, stirring a coup or something to that effect. They really evoke those types of images and those emotions out of me, and I've really enjoyed them. So all of those guys, they were super cool.
Yeah, I was thinking when you were watching Deep Space Nine, Rachel, because there was mention of some orders coming down for the Defiant to help protect a brigade of Starfleet Marines. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I want to see that story.
Starfleet Marines.
Yeah, because we did see a couple of Starfleet soldiers over the course of Deep Space Nine, but as far as I know, that's all we saw. of Starfleet's actual armed forces. So, yeah, I mean, that would be cool. Who knows? Maybe, or hopefully someday we'll actually get maybe an EU book that actually focuses on some of the troops in the war we just saw with the Klingons, because that would be cool. But what did you think of some of the supporting characters? Did any of them jump out at you?
I really liked Captain Korapati.
Mm-hmm.
I liked that there were Indian characters.
There was, it seemed like there was a lot of representation in a lot of the supporting characters.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely the case, but it's like it seems like there. I feel like there hasn't been very many Indian characters in Star Trek.
Yeah, true.
Star Trek is diverse, but so I was glad to see that because there are a lot of Indian people on the planet.
Yes,
so it would stand to reason that there'd be quite a few of them in the future.
In Starfleet, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so that was good. I liked him. He was a good presence.
Mm-hmm.
And I also liked Shannon Moulton.
Mm-hmm.
Her mom is definitely mentioned, or maybe she's mentioned. Somebody Moulton is mentioned in TOS episodes. So.
The name given in the episode was actually Molson, but yeah, that's who Dayton Ward based that name off of, because it was E. Molson in the TOS episode, and
that's her mom.
And her mom was named Eliana Moulton.
Okay. Yeah.
So I'm pretty sure that's the same person. But yeah, and I also like the doctor, like the kind of annoying doctor on the Narbonne. And this isn't a character, but the Narbonne itself, like the process that described actually lifting off of the planet and landing on the planet as a colony ship. I thought that was cool. Like, they have to brace for when the natural gravity kicks in.
Yeah, it makes their stomach feel weird.
Yeah, and the artificial gravity kicks off. And I thought that stuff was cool. But well, very well said, guys. But we have to, of course, talk about the biggest, most consequential cameo in this book. Yeah, you're laughing. You know where I'm going with this. Which featured characters from Conscience of the King, particularly Thomas Layton, and a young, brash, and capable teenager with a pretentious-sounding name, James Tiberius Kirk. So right up front, and Cicero, you had mentioned this at the top of the show, but I have to give kudos to actor Robert Petkoff, who performed the audiobook, because he does such an awesome job in recreating the verbal stylings of William Shatner.
He really did.
He did such a good, and you mentioned this to me at first because you had told me that that Kirk makes an appearance, which I pretty much expected anyway, but I probably wouldn't have known to actually listen for that unless you, Rachel, had told me that. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And I loved how Kirk himself was described in this story. The things that immediately come to me when he's asked by the security team and Commander Georgiou if he was trying to break into the computer system, he just goes, yes.
Right.
And the way that it's described is because he doesn't believe he was doing anything wrong. And that's such a Kirk aspect, like he was not a guy as a Starfleet captain to follow orders if he thought the orders were not serving the greater good. And this is sort of a microcosm of that, which I loved. And even there was a Kirk Fu reference because he has these security people rush him and he's half their size and he still manages to get them off of him.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's Kirk Fu.
He already knew Kirk
he
Fu.
already could do it. He could already move his body in a way that completely flung larger people than himself off of him in the most dramatic ways possible, as we saw so often in TOS. So I thought that was great. But, also Thomas Layton, we don't see much of him in Conscience of the King, but you just get this like bubbling total rage in the episode from him. And obviously we see that half of his face is gone.
Right.
And I love that the book gave context to that because he could have gotten it replaced, but the book explains that he chose not to, as sort of a reminder of what he experienced. And I thought that made perfect sense within the context of the story. But overall, what did you guys think of taking a look at Tom Layton and our brief encounter with the future captain of the Starship Enterprise? Cicero, this had to have kind of made you excited.
It did. So, again, because of my lack of awareness or lack of memory of Conscience of the King from TOS, Thomas Layton wasn't a tip off for me that I was about to get an early Jim Kirk, but the whole Jim Kirk thing was super, super cool. Now, the thing that confused me was the fact that Kirk's mom was talking about his father.
Yes.
And, as far as I knew, his father was dead, or at least I'm not sure if that was alternate timelines, because of its, the Kelvin timeline or what was going on. So that was the thing.
So the way that it was explained by Alex Kurtzman and Roberto Orsi was that had the Narada not shown up in front of the Kelvin, Winona Kirk had basically asked the medical personnel on board the Kelvin to make sure that she wasn't actually going to go into labor until they returned to Earth, because that's where they were headed. And then the incursion of the Narada diverted them, and she basically had to get the baby out. So yes, in the Prime timeline, we know that that George Kirk survives until at least 2266, because Spock even mentions in the 2009 movie that George survived to see Jim become captain of the Enterprise. So yes, everything's kosher as far as I know when it comes to that.
So so I mean that was the big takeaway. That was the big, hey, wait a minute, moment for me with regards to that. But the rest of it was awesome. Like the rest of it, to hear Jim Kirk talk about what he was doing, why he was doing it, and to show the aptitude and the precocious nature of who he is, led me to believe that he, of course, would grow up one day to be one of the greatest commanders in the history of Starfleet.
Yeah. Very true. Rachel, young Jim Kirk.
Definitely put a smile on my face.
Yeah.
I mean, you were there, right?
No, I wasn't
running to you.
Or
did I text you?
You sent me a text. Yeah.
No, I totally out of left field for me. I just wasn't expecting to see him in this. And
you would hope to, though, because you had said at the end of the Desperate Hours book that you wanted him to show up in this book.
Yeah, but then I forgot about that.
Oh, okay.
And so, and especially not. I thought if he was going to be in it, he would be in the scene where the people actually die. But since he was not, when you saw him afterwards, it was great. And I liked the characterization of Thomas Layton. I think really adds to his character in the Conscience of the King.
Yeah. Yeah, because we only briefly saw him, and he was just angry all the time. And then this, we actually see, like, holy crap, he suffered a lot.
Killed his parents. So
yeah. I mean, I was a huge, because this is for context purposes. If you haven't read the book and are still listening to this for some reason, this is only one chapter. Young Jim Kirk is only there pretty much for one chapter. And I feel like it was just enough, like it certainly wasn't too much. And I also don't feel like it was too little, because we actually did get quite a bit of classic Kirk out of this, which you wouldn't have thought coming from the fact that he was a 13-year-old kid. So, no, I mean, I absolutely love the way that he was characterized, and I really enjoyed how Georgiou seemed to recognize that there was something that was special about him. I mean, it was a little ham-fisted, but in this respect, I can absolutely forgive it, because they didn't give us too much. Like, it could have been all about Kirk, right? I mean, they could have done that very easily. And instead, he's just one aspect of this larger tragedy. But for those of us who know James T. Kirk really, really well, it's easy to see how this would be a foundational moment in his life. and I thought it was handled brilliantly in the actual material. Well, what about Kodos, guys? Because we met Kodos kind of in an off-kilter way in the episode, or Cicero,
Right.
you met him pretty much for the first time in a substantive way in this book. So why don't you walk us through that? Because obviously you didn't
Right.
have a huge well of information to draw from before reading this book, and today you just finished Kodos' story. So how does that all kind of come together in your mind?
Well, I mean, it's a complete story for me now.
Yeah.
And the brilliance of this book is that, well, I kind of understood, and to be fair, the moment in the atrium, the arena, the graveyard that it became, was when I really started paying attention. Like,
Okay.
I was 65, 70% focused, as I was listening to it on my commute, before that moment. And it happens fairly early in the course of the book. But they just kind of set everything up. But as he's giving his speech and he's explaining things to people, my spidey sense went off. And I said, oh, somebody's about to die. And, and maybe lots of people are about to die, but I'm not exactly sure. And that's when I really started to pay attention. And the fact that he gives this speech, and it talks about the sacrifice and all of this other stuff, and then he does what he does, was horrifying. But when you listen to what he had to say about it, or at least understanding the description of Kodos, of Adrian Kodos, the governor or Adrian Kodos, the scientist who basically had to become governor, who decided that this version of eugenics was the way that they would survive. Where he had to make these hard choices, gives you a little bit of empathy, and it gives you some sense of understanding of what was going on through his head at that particular moment. And it makes sense in the most perverse ways possible. Why someone faced with global extinction, or at least, colony-wide extinction, would do what he feels like he needs to do to try and preserve the healthiest among them as long as he possibly can in the face of these, two terrible choices. And I think they did a really good job within the book of articulating his level of regret, that he definitely regretted the decision, especially in light of the fact that the Narbonne showed up much sooner than anyone had anticipated. Soon enough, in fact, that he never, within like a week or something like that, the Narbonne, the Narbonne was really there. Soon. So there was no need for any of this stuff to even have happened. So the fact is that he definitely did show some remorse for what he had done, but he also wasn't remorseful enough to the point where he felt like, all right, I did something horrible. I totally regret the decision that I made. And here I'm going to pay for that decision. He stood behind his decision, realized that this was the only decision, it was the best decision of horrible choices that had to be made with the information that he was given, and he was going to live by those decisions and try to preserve his life. And then, of course, we know that he did, at the end of the book. And then, of course, in Conscience of the King. But in Conscience of the King, again, you could see a man now 20 years removed from this terrible decision, that the weight of it all has weighed on him heavily his entire life. and that he clearly regrets having made that decision, and but again was never so remorseful that he would turn himself in, but he was still, he still definitely wanted to make amends, at least by entertaining people and being kind of a nonviolent actor, literally a nonviolent actor in a way that he could bring some cheer and good fortune to people across the galaxy. So it definitely helped to flesh out this character that you only know as one of the most vile people in the history of humankind during the course of the Federation.
Mm-hmm. Sure. That was a very understanding perspective for Governor Kodos. That's very interesting. Rachel?
I mean, I don't feel as much empathy for him as Cicero. I think he made some real bad calls, some real unethical calls. But yeah, like the book does explain why he did what he did, and it kind of because Starfleet couldn't be 100% honest with the colony about when ships were going to get there because there were covert activities going on, right? So they couldn't say how close some of the ships were because they were, top secret. So there's kind of an underlying thing there that, if Starfleet had been more honest, this wouldn't have happened.
Right.
But, I still in the way that it's characterized in this book, what happened on Tarsus IV wouldn't have happened if Kodos wasn't there.
And if he didn't assume power.
Yeah, and if he didn't assume power. So, ultimately, I think that the, responsibility for what happened lies on him. And he's not a nice dude in the book. No. But yeah, I mean, I understand feeling empathy for the amount of regret that he lived with the rest of his life. But I would say that's a fitting punishment for what he did.
Right. Yeah, I don't really share any empathy for him, really. I mean, you do see that the choice weighed on him, but the thing that sticks with me about him, particularly as it relates to this book, is that the governor that he deposed had described him as sort of a non-caring intellectual, where he looked at every problem that had befallen the colony as something that could have been solved through purely mathematics. And obviously he took that to the absolute nth degree. And
she found that comforting at the time because he seemed so calm.
Yes,
right?
That's a pivotal detail.
Yeah.
Because it comes out as someone who might be measured and reasoned in the ability to deal with the problem. It doesn't necessarily strike you in the moment, or at least before the horror begins, that maybe he has a problem with feeling empathy in his brain. Maybe he has like a psychological issue, which you could make an argument about, considering that if Lenore was his daughter, she wasn't exactly the most stable person you came across either. So
she got that from somewhere.
she had to have gotten it from somewhere. And so I have a hard time empathizing with him insofar as he seems like, and I know this is a pejorative term. We probably have scientists that listen to this show. I won't use this term I'm married to a scientist, obviously, but Kodos is an egghead who got in way over his head because he was only looking at this as a numbers game. I don't necessarily doubt that if he was never in this kind of position of power, maybe he wouldn't have had the impetus or the ability to do anything remotely like this. But that mistake cost him significantly. It basically cost him his life. Not in the sense that he would be killed, obviously, but he had to abandon who he was completely. And he also had this small but devoted sect of followers behind him that completely discounted the moral implications of what he had done. in order to defend him. And he didn't question them. And he, even when he's talking to Captain Kirk 20 years after the fact, he's still, he doesn't want to admit who he is, but he's still kind of trying to defend those actions. Which,
well, yeah, and I think that's because he believed them.
Right, sure.
Like, I think, that there was, man. So the thing about, even the most villainous of people believe that they're the hero of their own story.
True. Yes.
And I think that Adrian Kodos believed himself to be heroic because he was given an impossible task.
Mm-hmm.
Either we all die quickly, or some people, half of us die. The sick and the indigent die now, so that the rest of us have a chance to live either longer or long enough that we can either find a cure and then repopulate this colony. And those were his choices based on the information that he had available. And and again, he looked at this very, very clinically, and it was, these were the choices. Like, when I do experiments in the lab, these are the, and I'm faced with these types of decisions. It's very, it's very easy to emotionally remove yourself from making those types of decisions with simple cells or primitive animals. But he used that same type of rationale to and moral compass to make a decision about sentient beings. And because he felt like he had to, and he felt like this was the only choice. So of course, 20 years later, when he talks to Kirk, he's still going to work within the confines of that reality, of that moment, not the reality as it played out, as it bloomed, but the reality of that moment when he made that decision, including and the sycophants that followed him believed the same things that he did. And they were, what else are you supposed to do? Like, this is who I am, and this is the choice that I have to make. I am Adrian Clow.
And by the way, I just love the fact that a 50-year-old TV episode was the impetus for this kind of discussion.
It is.
Story.
It is awesome.
This is one of the things that I love about Star Trek, is that you never know how something that was told in a previous story is going to feed something in the future. And this book takes full advantage of the concept that was explored in Conscience of the King and turns it into something that is fully three-dimensional from beginning to end. And that's just one of the reasons that I think this book is so easily recommended on my end. So very well said. I think we all have some different ideas of how sympathetic Governor Kodos actually is, but that makes things interesting. It definitely makes things interesting. But let's talk a little bit about plot, because we focus pretty much on character at this point. Obviously, we knew going into it, or at least if you'd never seen the episode before, you knew the impetus of the plot right from the outset. But one of the things that I really appreciated about the way that this story was told was just how detailed and real everything felt. The idea of Kodos and his followers enforcing martial law was interesting before the Narbonne arrived. And like we mentioned before, the description of the reality of being on a colony ship as it breaks gravity is really cool. It's just like a nice contextual touch with the world. But the story also moves along at a pace that it's probably a little slower than it needs to be, but it uses that time to fill in the details of everything really, really well. So what sticks out with you guys about the way that the story itself was told and the way that the plot moved along? Rachel?
I liked the frequent change in perspective.
Okay.
So, I think the events in the book happen over a pretty short span of time, right?
Yeah.
But the thing about, when something traumatic is happening, time seems to expand.
Mhm.
And I think that the book captured that sort of feeling really well by sort of switching around to different people and giving a lot of detail of what was happening sort of minute by minute. It's really like there's not a lot of gaps in the time. So I think that kept things really exciting, even though, you're working with a really condensed timeline.
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. Cicero, how about you?
Yeah, I think what Rachel said, it is when you're in a crisis, every second feels like a minute. Every hour feels like a day, and I think the book did a fantastic job of capturing all of that angst, all of that stress. And you
kind of like life in 2018,
right, exactly, exactly. And I think I really appreciated the fact that we did get a lot of the same moments from multiple perspectives, to really kind of fully, as you said before so eloquently, give each moment 3 dimensions.
Yeah, it was a really cool way to tell a story, and it seemed to emphasize just how harrowing all of these events were, and how unique they are, because we certainly haven't seen. The movies and the actual episodes definitely save some big moments for big moments, but something like this, it probably would have been more at home in tonally speaking, in an episode of something like Deep Space Nine. But just what a really cool and sort of refreshing way to give that sort of greater context to a big event in the 23rd century. But one thing I did definitely want to ask you guys about specifically was the interlude device of the book within a book. Because it was kind of, at least for me, at first it was confusing. Right. I didn't really understand exactly what was going on, but it became much, much clearer over the course of the book. And the book within a book is called The 4000, and it recapped the disaster and helped give greater context to the way that Federation society viewed the tragedy in the context of history. So did you guys feel like this enhanced the experience because we shifted, from past to future, or past to present, however you want to look at it? It's all relative. But do you feel like that enhanced the experience in understanding the implications of this whole ordeal? Or did you find it maybe jarring because it moved between time periods so quickly? Cicero?
No, you know what? It made me think of, and I'm gonna crush genres, pop culture geek streams right now. It made me think of the Halo podcast miniseries, Hunt the Truth.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which, if any of you are out there are fans of Halo, or Master Chief, and you have not listened to Hunt the Truth season 1, please do. It is phenomenal. But it really, it works in very much the same way as like this kind of an investigative, biographical retelling of events, of an event, as they go and they try and find different people that witnessed that event and get their perspectives from that time, and now that some time has passed, their reflections on the events and how they unfolded. I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed the fact that was happening. It didn't confuse me in the least. I really had a sense of what was going on almost from the moment go. And, I appreciated, the context that it gave for different characters outside of the crisis. So, now that they've had some time to reflect on those, on the issues and the things that happened, and it wasn't so emotionally raw, to be able to get those feelings and jot those down, for posterity was really, really cool. I enjoyed that a lot.
Sure. Rachel?
Yeah, I liked it. I think it helped if you had no idea what Tarsus IV was. It really would have helped you with the context. And it also, allows us to get, some of the perspective of sort of Kodos's followers after the fact. And even if, without having to go to their POVs in the book. This was a clever device.
Yeah. And I particularly liked the section that checked in with one of the guys who was actually in a Federation penal colony. First of all, because I find even though it hasn't been explored a lot, in fact, probably the most potent look we've gotten at the Federation penal system was in the very first episode of Voyager, when Janeway goes to visit Tom Paris. So the Federation philosophy on rehabilitation is very enlightened. And it's kind of cool to see that this guy, he had taken ownership over what he had done, and he had seen the error of his ways and was able to speak frankly about everything that had happened. He realized that he lost his freedom, but that doesn't mean that he can't at least try and better himself along the way. So yeah, I thought that stuff was really cool. And by the end of the book, even being as familiar with Tarsus IV as I am, I found a lot of value in because you would expect, like, if there's anything resembling a bookstore in the 23rd century and you walk into one in the 2250s, let's say, there would probably be a book like this about an event like that. And it's probably one that I would read. So I thought that it was a really cool way to sort of show what the implications were on Federation society as far as the events on Tarsus IV are concerned. Anything else jump out at you guys just about the way that the story was told that you might want to mention?
Just the fact that I think it did a really good job of highlighting ancillary characters that were traumatized by these events, and really gave you a sense of just how, once martial law was instituted, just how much it disrupted life on the colony. And I thought that was really, really well illustrated within the book.
Sure. Rachel?
Yeah, I don't really have any extra.
That's fine. I was just asking. What about just emotional beats? Like, what jumps out at you guys about emotional moments that maybe struck you? Because obviously it's trying to portray a completely horrific event. Do you guys think it fulfills that promise with genuine emotional weight? Just to offer my own example, I think the thing that I got emotional about that I wasn't expecting to, first of all, I got unexpectedly emotional when the 4,000 were actually executed. I thought that the tragedy was really well emphasized in the moment. But the other big sort of emotional moment that I felt was actually after the event was winding down. The Narbonne had actually left Tarsus IV and had left the Enterprise with, committing to recovery efforts. And Lorca was in the gym, and he was just beating the living shit out of the punching bag. And his knuckles were bleeding, and he kept saying he was fine before, but you really got the idea that he was very much not fine. And I thought that did a really good job of sort of emphasizing the cracks that something like this, having to endure something like this, can create in someone's psyche. And of course, there was that great moment where Lorca reflected on the fortune cookie that he had shared with Belena that said, hate cannot be conquered with hate. Hate is only conquered by love, thereabouts. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. But I was not expecting Gabriel Lorca, with his sort of machismo attitude, to provide a sense of sort of emotional and psychological fragility. And I was actually surprisingly affected by that. But Rachel, you have a choice of an emotional moment in the book that jumps out at you?
I think Shannon Moulton, like being with her, that really got me, because that kind of bothers me. Kids having to go through traumatic stuff. Um,
And you can't fully explain it to them because they don't completely understand it.
yeah, and her stuffed animal and how she gave it to Georgiou.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was really nice.
it was, and it got a great follow up too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it did.
Cicero.
I'm listening to your answers, and my answer makes me really think about what it says about me more than it's what it says about the book.
That's all right.
But I think one of my major emotional takeaways was just how well the characters were human. You know how well they did a job at humanizing all of the characters. Both you're talking about the fragility of Gabriel Lorca. We talk about the emotional resonance, and the emotional weight that, Commander Georgiou had, throughout the story. But, you really were able to feel the rage of characters like, Jim Kirk and the all but catatonic Thomas Layton, Tommy Layton and despite what everybody else says, I think that the way the story was written and the way that the characters were fleshed out, that there was some humanizing elements of Adrian Kodos that you could rationally, or at least I could rationally glean from listening and reading the book.
Well, I let me expand on my point a little bit, because I think you're absolutely right in that it opens up the dimension to Kodos significantly. Like, you understand by the time this book is over, particularly, but even in the moment after you learn more about him and how he interacts with people in the government and all of those things, you understand what led him to his conclusion.
Right.
As Spock once famously said, I do not agree. I understand.
Right. Yeah.
And I think you do very much get that.
Yeah. So I've really appreciated just how human all of those characters were. Every last one of them, and then of course we do get some follow up on a lot of those characters in the epilogue. Which I thought was super cool. I was kind of hoping and waiting, as we got to see a young cadet or ensign, Moulton, that we would also get to see a young Jim Kirk, but alas, we did not. We did not.
But it does kind of make you wonder, like, maybe Georgiou wrote a letter to get him into the academy or something. I mean, who knows? She saw promise. She saw promise in him. Absolutely. All right. Well, let's move on to one of my favorite things, and the continuity of everything. All right, because I've got a couple of little points. Nothing huge.
Pedantic continuity.
Although pedantic continuity. Well, not too.
Make a theme song for that, Chris.
Pedantic continuity, or something dumb like that would be fun. But I mean, something that I appreciated and that I was genuinely surprised by was the appearance of the Enterprise, because it makes sense. 2246, we were about a year removed from the launch of the Enterprise, at least as it was established in continuity. So we know that 11 years from now, when Discovery is in full swing and Michael Burnham is running the corridors with Sylvia Tilly, the Enterprise is regarded, and the Constitution class itself is regarded as like the definitive ship to get an assignment on. So now take that to the novelty of the Constitution class right after they first launched. I mean, it had to have been just the most sheerly impressive piece of technology, the most impressive starship to ever come along. You have the Constitution class USS Enterprise serving in a recovery capacity, best possible ship you can have. I mean, any Constitution class is fine, but we ascribe more value to the Enterprise because we know exactly what that ship is going to mean for the future. But I was pretty surprised at how well fleshed out, even in just some short appearances, that Captain Robert April was. did April seem to connect with his sole canonical appearance in the animated series in the Counterclock incident to you guys, or did it feel like the book kind of went into a different direction with him? Cicero, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think that we've got someone that was. Well, so the funny thing is that he was definitely older and seasoned within the book, but the Counterclock incident, he was an old man. So and that was the thing that was weird to me. That so I guess we're roughly 25 years after the events of Tarsus IV at this point, by that point in Counterclock incident. So maybe he could have aged that much. But I mean, that was the weird thing. I mean, it was cool. Again, it's anytime that you get to see, if you consider the Enterprise like a member of your family,
as I do,
as one is wont to do. So that it's definitely always cool when you get to see, or you get reintroduced to one of their former ancestors, and so that that was awesome. I mean, again, April doesn't have a lot to do in drastic measures except be there and again call out to longtime fans of the series something else to kind of make them go get giddy by mentioning his name and the Enterprise and his crazy beautifully British accent. But yeah, I mean, I guess the crazy continuity part that I noticed was not from drastic measures, but from the Counterclock incident, where Dr. April, his wife, mentions that Captain April, at this point now Admiral April, was the very first or ambassador, was the very first captain of Enterprise. And we know, of course, that Jonathan Archer was the very first captain of the Enterprise. Oh, and she said that his Enterprise was the first ship to that had a warp drive, the first fleet ship that had a warp drive in it. So, and we know that Captain Archer's ship was able to go. And he was definitely the captain of that ship now. We're talking about a show that came out in the 70s versus a show that came out in the early aughts, but
well, the way that's typically broken out in the continuity is that they're actually technically correct by ascribing April as the first captain of the Enterprise, but the Federation Starship Enterprise.
That is correct.
Captain Archer is a member of the Earth Starfleet that predates the Federation. So it's a good way to sort of sidestep the fact that, the show came along relatively late in the game for Star Trek that established much of the early history in the 22nd century. But I can see how that would have jumped out at you, especially as a fan of Enterprise.
What about the fact that she talked about the warp stuff, Chris?
Yes, how do you reconcile that? I don't. That's an anachronism. that does not work. It's a bit paradoxical.
You need Janeway to go back in time and fix it.
Call the Admiral.
Yeah.
Rachel, did you get any impressions from Captain April?
He sounded like my kind of guy because he wears a cardigan over his uniform as a person who is also always cold. I would probably be wearing a cardigan over my uniform.
Very well. Well, the next thing I need to ask you about, because although not strictly canon, the tragedy on Tarsus IV does play a pretty big part in Kirk's childhood in author David Goodman's autobiography of James T. Kirk, which Rachel has read in its entirety. I haven't finished it, but she has. It's a point of shame that I haven't finished it. I'm sure I will soon. But from your perspective, how do the depictions of Tarsus IV differ in drastic measures compared with that book? And do you have a preference?
So the characterization of Tarsus IV is different in each book. So in the autobiography, he describes Tarsus IV as like a technocratic colony, wherein, they keep, detailed data and do all these projections and algorithms all the time to keep everything running. Whereas in this book, it's more of, they're sort of like back to the land kind of people, it seems like. So, in the autobiography, it's depicted as Kodos is more of a product of the culture of Tarsus IV taken too far, as opposed to, like an individual actor. There's also some like differences in, just what happens. So in the autobiography, he and Tom Layton view the killing from the roof, not from like a tunnel. And they actually talk to Kodos, and Kodos like checks his list, and he's like, oh no, they're not on it. You can bring them to the hospital. Those things I can headcanon away as James Kirk is a little bit of a narcissist, and maybe he thinks he talked to Kodos. He didn't really, or would write that in his autobiography, even if it didn't quite happen like that. But he wants to tell a good story. But those are just little things. But yeah, like the biggest thing that for me, like, differentiates it as a, like a different person is telling this story is like the Tarsus IV itself is completely different. And there's of course no, references to Lorca being on the planet or Georgiou or anything like that. But those things didn't exist at the time when that book was written.
It came out in 15 or 16, something. It came out pretty recently.
Yeah, pretty recently, but definitely before Discovery. Yeah. So, and David Goodman is really good about incorporating all of every reference into his book. So if it had been there, he would have incorporated it.
Yeah, because you're reading the autobiography of Jean-Luc Picard.
Yes.
And he also wrote that.
Yeah.
And he also has an autobiography for Spock coming out.
Yeah.
Which I'll be really interested to see if it mentions Michael at all. Because I kind of feel like now it would be a bad idea not to make reference to her in some capacity.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think the canonical connection with the autobiography of James T. Kirk is far more dubious than this book. Just because this book had direct involvement to a degree of members of the actual writer's room of Discovery. And those are the people that are steering the ship.
Well, and of course, the autobiography of James Kirk is just James Kirk's recollections, which, he's kind of old. As a long time ago, he gets things wrong.
I don't know if Kirk is a narcissist. Kirk is not William Shatner. Like that's I always make that determination to people that I'm more of a fan of Captain Kirk than I am of William Shatner, because I don't think I'd get along with Shatner, and I think I would get along with Kirk. But
fair. But I do think Kirk might be the kind of guy who would embellish to tell a nice story in his autobiography.
But I mean, he doesn't need to embellish a lot of things.
No, like if he was telling this story, post Discovery, I think him meeting Georgiou would be some huge point of pride.
That's true. Yes.
But as it is, he does mention Robert April, but that's that's it.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Fallen in love with the Enterprise. Well, another thing that I thought was worth asking, since near the end of the book, in Georgiou's ready room aboard the Shenzhou, Shannon Moulton is there, and she mentions that in writing the 4000, she tried to contact now Captain Lorca to get his perspective and to try and interview him because he was, right there on the ground. He apparently declined. And this section in the book took place just a few months before the events of the pilot. So, Cicero.
Yes.
Do you think he declined because it was at a point where he legitimately felt like he didn't want to revisit those traumatic events, or because it wasn't really Lorca that got the invitation to talk about it?
Well, it was Lorca who got the invitation to talk about it. But which Lorca? was it? And so the answer is obviously that it was Mirror Lorca who received that invitation and had no recollection of these events. So it was easy enough to just go ahead and deny the invitation as opposed to try and explain away or get himself involved in some nasty web of lies that he couldn't really navigate himself out of. So, right. That was easy enough for him to do.
Yeah. Rachel, you have a thought?
I think it was Mirror Lorca. He didn't want to blow his cover.
Yeah. Yep. I think you're right. And I think the people at Memory Alpha even speculate that Lorca had been displaced in 2255. And we know that this quasi epilogue was in 2256. So yeah, that wasn't the right guy. And, but it still sounded kind of right to Georgiou that he would have turned it down, even though she hadn't seen him in a really long time, which I thought was kind of a nice touch. But, okay. So we've gone through the book. I have to ask you guys about the so-called post-credit scene to be found in Drastic Measures. Now, for people who are listening to the show, spoiler alert. If you don't want to know anything about the tail end of this book and its possible, though admittedly remote implications for the future of the actual show, you should stop listening right here. At the end of this Red Alert Klaxon, we will begin talking about a spoilerific aspect of this book's epilogue that could possibly have implications on the TV show itself. Okay, you've been warned. So, one of the things that make this book feel so connected to both Discovery and the Trek universe at large, as we said before, is because the authors of the book collaborate with members of the show's real writers' room. Ward did a great job of setting up the fortune inside one of the fortune cookies in a flashback between Lorca and the love of his life, Belena. And in this post-credit scene, there's a character. Dayton Ward did a great job of setting up the fortune inside a fortune cookie. And we know that Lorca's family has a connection to fortune cookies in the show, but he reads this fortune to Belena in one of the quieter moments on Tarsus IV that he's sharing with her. And in this epilogue, at the very, very tail end of the book, and in the print version, it's even the very last thing that you see. Like, you have to go through the title pages and the rights pages and all of these other things, and it is just there at the tail end. There's a man, it doesn't say explicitly who he is, who's in a prison cell. He doesn't seem to find any way out whatsoever. He describes his jailers as having a common malevolence that sounds very familiar. And this guy, in one quiet moment, he's never seen his jailers' faces. He's resolved to find a way out, but he doesn't know how he got where he is. He doesn't know what the place is, but he pulls out this little slip of paper and unrolls it, and it's the fortune that Lorca and Belena had spoken about. We're led to believe that this is alive and well in the mirror universe, the prime vision of Gabriel Lorca. Doesn't know where he is, doesn't know why he's there, but he's there. And unlike what Admiral Cornwell seemed to think at the end of season 1 of the show, Gabriel Lorca's alive. Now, Cicero.
Yes.
You seem committed to this idea that Prime Lorca is never going to show up on future episodes of Star Trek Discovery. Even after reading that, you don't think it's a possibility?
No, I don't. I mean, I think that what we got was an undated snapshot of where Prime Lorca went to once he got to the mirror universe. That he was imprisoned, presumably by some of Mirror Lorca's cohorts, those people that were trying to overthrow the Empire and the Emperor.
Mm-hmm.
And then, once we get to the mirror universe and Discovery, he's nowhere to be found. I don't believe he's alive. I just don't believe he's alive. I think that Gabriel Lorca in both universes is dead.
Nice Men in Tights callback. I appreciate that.
No problem.
Rachel?
He's back, baby. Coming back. All right. Look, Jason Isaacs, he's alive. He's well. He needs money, I assume, at some point.
He will.
Yeah, to live. So he'll be back.
Well, and he liked it.
Yeah, and he had a good time.
Yeah, see, I don't think that it's cut and dry. I mean, why would Ward be allowed to include this, to keep the possibility for an appearance of this guy that we never met on the show? Why would he be allowed to put that into the book at all if there was not going to be a chance for Prime Lorca to show up at some point on the show?
So you could talk about it right here. That is
okay,
why.
but
that is why.
I don't know. I think it's a little short-sighted not to see the possibility that this could present, because it never even occurred to me before you mentioned it that his jailers could be Mirror Lorca's guys. I think that's actually a brilliant idea. Like, maybe he couldn't hold up his cover, so they realized, this isn't our leader. We better sequester him. But we probably shouldn't kill him, so let's just keep him off to the side. I don't know. I think there's a hell of a story that can be told
and maybe that's why Dayton Ward was allowed to tell that, to provide that little bit of breadcrumbs right there, is so that potentially he could write the story of the adventures of Prime Lorca in the Mirror Universe. Wouldn't that be a great book?
That would be a great book. I mean, obviously, I would love to see more of Jason Isaacs on the show, but I would take that. I think that would be a story, whether it's in the show or whether it's in a book. I think that's a story worth telling. I mean, I really do feel in my heart of hearts that at some point, even if it's season 7, that Gabriel Lorca is going to return. I just, in my head, and granted, I'm writing my own script, so who gives a shit? But still, in my head, I just see I see this moment where Michael is on the verge of being killed by someone. Then a shot comes out of a blinding light and kills her assailant. She looks up and she sees that face that she knows she should be terrified of. And she looks up at him and goes, "Lorca?" And he looks down at her and goes, "Who the hell are you?" And I would just love something like that to happen. I would just love it. And I mean, there's so much potential for Lorca. But of course, like I said, writing my own script, no one gives a shit. It's just in my head. I would like to see it. But yes, you're right, Cicero. Whether this happens in a book or whether it happens on the show, I would still just like it to happen.
Right on. Right on.
All right. So, what didn't you guys like about the book? Because we've been pretty effusive in our praise for what we did like. Cicero, what comes to your mind? Like what maybe didn't meet your level of expectations with this book?
It's not even a thing that didn't, whether or not it met my level of expectation. I think, and this is not a negative at all, is the, because we really didn't talk about the narration and the character work, by the narrator, by the reader was phenomenal, was really, really great. But what it did for me was, the fact that he took the time to do all of these different accents, was super great. But what it did for me was make me think back to this one problem that I fundamentally I've had with Star Trek over the years.
Mm-hmm.
We're at the very least 200 years into our future. Why? And the world is without war. We've got, we're essentially homogenized as a species. why do people still have accents?
Yeah.
I actually thought about that while I was listening too. I was like, wouldn't they all have the same accent?
Right.
Like even if it was running through the universal translator.
Well, not even
Yeah.
that if it was running through the why do humans have different accents? You know, maybe there be certain affectations that are slightly different from other people, but there's, you know, in no one's world would Chekhov be saying nuclear vessels, because he grew up speaking English natively. There would be no reason for a regional dialect, maybe a regional dialect, but not a whole nother language outside of English, because we're homogenized as a species. Why would you make that more difficult by having a language that is something other than the primary language that everyone speaks?
I think that that's a fair point. The only thing that comes to my mind, because this is something that I've thought about just over the course of my time as a Star Trek fan, is that the Federation as a society values inclusivity and multiculturalism almost above everything else. And like you have people, and I'm getting into political territory now, and I'm sorry for people who are listening who hate when politics bleeds into this, but it always kind of does. Like
it's Star Trek.
If you're a cognizant Star Trek fan, then you know that politics bleeds into it, at least on some level. But you know, there's people like those in the United States Congress who vote continuously to try and make English the official language of the United States. And I remember like in 2008, this came up, and it listed all of these people who so stupidly voted against English being the official language of the United States. And, you know, as a knee-jerk reaction, I can see that. But then if you look a little bit deeper, well, we probably valued it more even just a decade ago than we seem to now. But there's a great deal of symbolic power in the idea that we are a melting pot. You know, for the longest time, the idea that the United States of America is a melting pot of different cultures all coming together means that, well, first of all of our signs and everything are in English anyway. So making English the official language would sort of discount the idea that everyone comes here and everyone is welcome to come here to make a better life for themselves. And I kind of maybe I just extrapolate that onto the Federation. Like if you speak another language natively, the language barrier is all but eliminated by technology. So there's no real necessity to sort of do away with other languages. You could pretty much speak however and whatever you want to. And so I guess that's what comes to my mind. But you have something you wanted to add about that?
Not really. I just think that in a super technologically advanced society, you would probably have some sort of homogenization of...
Well, we're seeing that, though. You're right. We're seeing that. Like, I think, didn't you even mention to me a while ago that English in the UK and English in the United States is closer than it's ever been because of the more connected nature of the world today? Like, the dialects would have evolved into entirely different and perhaps indiscernible directions if that technology connectivity
I definitely
didn't exist.
didn't mention that to you because that's the first I've heard of it, but that makes sense because, like, I mean, languages evolve like species, right? And that you get separated and that's how you get new languages. But yeah, because we're connected, all of English is sort of runs together. But you still have people with heavy accents, but it's like it's like if you move into a city and then connect with more, you know, a bunch of people with different sort of regional accents, you kind of like
develop
absorb.
those affectations. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Weren't you telling me the other day, Cicero, that you were having trouble ordering coffee?
Yeah, I was
right.
I was having trouble ordering. How do you say it? Coffee? Because as a New Yorker, you say coffee. And it's one of those things. But as a person who now lives in the Midwest and lives, you know, specifically in Chicago and has for now a dozen years, I find myself one of the things that the dialect affectations of the Midwest is that your short A's are more pronounced. So you say things like cash and carry and that kind of stuff. But I'll find myself at times saying that, oh, I've got a podcast tonight. And that's, and that's obviously that was exaggerated a little, but I can hear it. And despite my want to not do that, it is what has become natural to me as a result of living in this place and speaking with the people that live here so often and so frequently, and just kind of being immersed within this place. When you look at the 23rd century Earth, where you can literally beam yourself across the world at, within seconds. And, presumably, even, flight on the planet is such that you can get from one point to the other point on the planet within minutes, that it doesn't seem realistic to me that people would have a different, well, maybe they maybe they have different dialects of English, and maybe there are certain affectations that as a result of the places that they live, but there is no way on green Earth that I would believe that people natively spoke a tongue other than English in the 23rd century in a world that is as small as the one that occupies the Federation. And
I think Firefly kind of ran with that, right? Because there were only two real surviving languages in Fireflies. Firefly was supposed to be something like 500 years in the future, and the only two languages that had survived apparently were English and Chinese, which reflected the fact that America and China were two of the last superpowers. I can definitely see that perspective. Absolutely. Rachel, something that you didn't like about this book?
I think I just might have preferred to read it in book form as opposed to audiobook.
Oh, why is that?
I do a little bit better with fiction, reading it with my eyes. As opposed to listening with my ears. This is just something that I've noticed, especially since I got a library card and I started listening to more books. And I find that fiction
first of all, you got a library card recently. You're not talking about since you were a kid.
No. I got a library card a few months ago. And so I started being able to listen to audiobooks more frequently because they don't cost $30 a piece. Mm-hmm. And I've just noticed that nonfiction, I really love listening to those audiobooks, but fiction, for some reason, I have a little bit of a harder time following along because I'll notice that especially because I very often listen while I'm doing other things that'll take my attention away momentarily.
I see. Yeah.
And, with a nonfiction book, that's, fine. You missed a sentence, but what's happening. Mm-hmm. But
every word counts in fiction.
Yeah, and I think it's more than that. It's that I have for some reason an easier time visualizing things when I'm reading it with my eyes. And I don't know why that is.
Okay.
But that was just I was losing the thread a lot when I was reading or listening to this. Mm-hmm. And it was because I was doing other things and I was really stressed out while I was listening to parts of it. And so I was just completely going off on my own tangents.
Stressed out because of something in life or because of the book?
Because of something in life.
Okay.
And the book is not relaxing. So it was not helping.
So the next Discovery tie-in novel you will probably read.
I would like to read it, or I will have to reserve my listening to, laying in bed, awake, not before bed, because I'll fall asleep. But, and then just, really focus on it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. But nothing about the book that you maybe didn't necessarily like.
No, I don't really remember, I did find myself thinking as well, why do these people have accents? These countries don't even exist. I don't know. But
all right, fair enough. Well,
I'll be speaking an accent that is nothing like any of our accents, because it'd be like a combination of all the
Like
accents.
Esperanto is the only language that survives.
Right.
in the future, something like that.
Right, a language no one speaks currently now.
Well, as for me, I think the only thing that I maybe didn't like, and that's putting it strongly because I pretty much loved this book. Sometimes, as much as I love the world building and as much as I love the contextualization of what it's like to feel an experience or to see an experience, sometimes it got a little too descriptive. Like, I didn't necessarily need to know the shape of the chair that a character was sitting on sometimes and stuff like that. That was more just like an efficiency thing that took up some valuable story real estate. But overall, I don't really have any complaints about this book. It pretty much checked all of the boxes that I look for in an expanded universe Star Trek story. And it didn't overuse characters that we already knew really well. And it provided greater context, first of all, to a vision of a character we never met on the show. I found a significant amount of value in that. And it's just great to see more of Georgiou. So pretty much great all around. I don't really have any negative things to say about Star Trek Discovery Drastic Measures. I found it to be a very enjoyable jaunt into the Star Trek universe from a perspective that was partially familiar with a new light shed on it because of Star Trek Discovery specifically. However, we're not done with Star Trek Discovery tie-in novels yet, because on June 5th, the next one, written by veteran Trek author James Swallow, who has written no less than 14 other Star Trek novels across almost every era, including some of Captain Riker's adventures aboard the USS Titan. The next Star Trek Discovery tie-in novel is called Fear Itself, and it's out this coming June, and the description is as follows. Lieutenant Saru is a Kelpian, a member of a prey species born on a world overrun by monstrous predators, and a being who very intimately understands the nature of fear. Challenged on all sides, he's determined to surpass his origins and succeed as a Starfleet officer aboard the USS Shenzhou. But when Saru breaks protocol in order to prove himself to his crewmates, what begins as a vital rescue mission to save a vessel in distress soon escalates out of control. Forced into a command role he may not be ready for, Saru is caught between his duty and the conflicting agendas of two antagonistic alien races. To survive, he will need to seek a path of peace against all odds and risk compromising the very ideals he's sworn to uphold. So how do you guys feel about this one on concept? Is this a story you're excited for? Any wishes for things you hope it explores about our favorite Kelpian? Cicero, as a big Saru fan, does this excite you?
I'm here for it, man. I'm 100% Team Saru, man. Give me some more Saru. Give it to me all the time. Let's get it.
All right. Rachel?
Yeah, I'm excited. I think Saru has the potential for having a really interesting inner life, and I'd like to hear more about it.
Yeah, we got a taste of it in Desperate Hours, but it didn't go as far as an entire book devoted to him could. I'll be interested to see it as well. A lot of it because Saru came to his own, it seems, the most dramatically over the course of the first season of the show. Like, he's a very different guy in the Vulcan Hello than he is compared with the season finale. So it'll be interesting to see maybe one of his first crisis situations unfold. So we'll definitely be taking a look at that, hopefully this coming summer. Obviously, Drastic Measures came out back in February. It took us a couple of months to get to it. But we'll definitely be taking a look at Fear Itself when it's available, and we will review it for you when we get the opportunity to. So, thank you very much. That's going to do it for episode 20 of Discovery Debrief. We hope you enjoyed the show, and if you did, please like and follow us on our social media channels. And if you would be so kind, we'd also appreciate it if you wrote a review for the show on iTunes or Facebook. It only takes a minute, and we'll be happy to read your review on the air when it's posted. If you have any questions, you can follow the show on Twitter at DSC Debrief, where you can also find all of our individual Twitter handles. And feel free to send us questions through Twitter our Facebook like page, or by emailing us directly at hailingfrequencies@discoverydebrief.com. Please be sure to set your courses for this feed for future episodes. And really, guys, be sure to keep your eyes on our social media channels for future plans. And hopefully, we'll have quite a surprise for you in our next episode, which we will be bringing to you soon. As always, though, until then, go boldly, my friends.